I think the 2019 to 2023, 2022, 2023 era of Ethereum layer 2 development, with some exceptions, has always been about like how do we one-to-one extend Ethereum block space, right? Like Arbitrum and Optimism was like, no, we're more Ethereum equivalent. Polygon is doing the same thing with the ZK EVM. Scroll, Tycho are all trying to be like so close to Ethereum. Starknet is the big differentiator here. They've always been like, I call them Stark maxis. They're just trying to maximize Starks. But there's a lot of layer 2s coming online this year that I think are really going to break that pattern. And I think we're seeing some of that same energy with what Jordi was talking about with being creative with how to construct your layer 2. Blast putting native yield into the layer 2 is like giving some opening up some like design space. We have Eclipse coming with the SVM to be on as a layer 2 on Ethereum, like brand new like playing field that like no other layer 2s are going for. There's Phoenix, which is a layer 2 based on fully homomorphic encryption. Like how do you even compare that to any of the layer 2s that we've talked about? Aztec has been around for a while, and you know, in the fullness of time they'll get there, and it will also be an extremely differentiated layer 2. And these are just the ones that I can think of in this breath. And I think there's overall been a lot of focus saying to like, hey, this whole like Ethereum equivalence, Ethereum alignment thing is great. And there's other things to focus on and other things to really innovate and experiment with. And so hopefully like the call here is that there's going to be like a resurgence of layer 2 experimentation. And I don't know how much juice there is to squeeze there. Like, is there like this massive new design space that's totally unexplored, or is it just like a nice little side quest? Jordi, maybe I'll start with you here. Like, how much is there in the world of layer 2 experimentation? Like, is there more or less than what people think?
Undeniably more. Like, not even like you can't imagine the kind of ideas and the things that haven't been touched upon because we're still need time to build all this stuff. But there's so much to explore. And I'm not just talking about like SVM versus EVM. I'm just talking about like, what kind of like incentives, what are you building? Blast is ultimately something that I keep coming back to because I've seen like, paradigms getting involved. Dan Robbins talking about like native rebasing token. They're going to change the contract. One of the issues that we're having is like, if you go rebasing, you can't integrate it into DeFi. If you go like, value accruing, then it depegs from the dollar and it's like a weird user experience. They're trying to just like, how 404 is just kind of like did this like unofficial new code, make rebasing and a part of the entire chain, right? So it's like native in the chain, like the contracts are like, if you're deploying, this is kind of like something you have to use. There's a lot of experimentation that's going to happen. I think, with Mantle, I've tried to experiment very heavily on just kind of like using, yield, using boost, using like an environment. There's like something very cool launching soon called Puff that's going to maybe double meth TVL right now is when we were chatting about meth a couple months ago, you guys were like, what's this meth thing, laughing off. It's soon going to be like maybe the second largest after Lido, I think, after like this next few months. Quite confident that we'll get to that 4 billion mark of TVL. And it's just because of like, individual creativity and trying to bring value to users and, make them like, have the best experience they can have. And there's so much experimentation. Mode is another L2 that's quite interesting. I talked to the founder and, I've seen them like do some pretty aggressive partnerships, try to generate like, some good, very strong yield with Athena and some of this other kind of higher yield options. The more established you are, the less risk you can take. And if you're up and coming, you just say like, screw it, like we'll do this. And you can go anywhere from extreme as like, I don't care about Ethereum alignment. Like I'm paying the security gas fee. Like just leave me alone. I'm paying for that. Now I'm just gonna like go in my own direction. And some people are doing that, and they'll have some community, and some are very much like you guys, very like Ethereum, like just the ethos and trying to represent that. So we'll see everything, and there's so much experimentation. I'm really excited.
Anthony, what are you most excited about on the layer 2 experimentation side? Yeah, I mean, I would first agree with what Jordi said. There's just so much kind of left to cover, and I think I said on the ETH Bull podcast we did last month or the month before, I think I remember saying that I was most bullish on the experimentation side of layer twos rather than the scalability side, because the scalability stuff was table stakes. We have that. You understand that layer twos are supposed to increase scalability. So what else can we do? And David ran through a long list of these other L2s that are either live right now or are coming that are doing lots of different experimentations. They're trying not to be EVM, of course, Eclipse with the SVM, and Fluent is doing ZK WASM stuff. So yeah, there's all that experimentation happening, and I'm really excited to see it play out. But I kind of always wonder like how much of that's actually going to be successful, how much of it will actually end up being enshrined in the Ethereum protocol itself. Like, is it a really good idea, but is it so good that it actually belongs in the Ethereum core protocol rather than at layer 2? Like, you know what I mean? There are some ideas like that. Like, for example, Tycho's working on based boosted rollups. Like that to me works better enshrined than maybe at layer 2, because the whole concept is using the layer 1 to kind of sequence transactions. So that might end up getting enshrined, right? So I think that there's that open question around what happens there. And it was funny because it makes me think of what I used to think about a lot of these layer 1s that were doing non kind of EVM or kind of different to Ethereum. I used to call them professor coins, where there was a lot of smart people working on them and they were building some really cool stuff, but I felt like they would never really build an ecosystem around it, because it was something that would like bolt on to an existing ecosystem as like a feature rather than it create its own ecosystem. And I think the most obvious example of that is like privacy coins, right? Zcash and Monero. Like, they have their own kind of small user bases, relatively small, I guess. But like, you put privacy on Ethereum and look what happened with Tornado Cash. It was used by so much, it had so much volume going through it that the US felt it was a threat and basically whacked it with the sanctions hammer. So I think that there are certain things that are better built, like, as feature sets rather than entire ecosystems. And I think we're going to see some of that play out in the layer 2 space. But the really powerful thing about the layer 2 space is that we get to experiment with those things. Because if it was just layer 1 Ethereum, you can't experiment on layer 1 Ethereum. You have to go through the whole governance process to just get a small EIP change in, which could take like 2 years. I mean, I was looking at one of the EIPs that's coming in Denkun that Uniswap needs to launch V4. It was proposed in 2018. So like almost 6 years ago, that EIP, and it's finally going in Denkun. So like, and that's why we saw a lot of these L1s offshoot off of Ethereum, right? Because they wanted to experiment, but they couldn't. Now we get to bring that experimentation in-house, right, with these layer 2s, and basically keep it in the Ethereum ecosystem and still export ETH as money to them, and basically keep it all, within ETH and Ethereum. And that's what makes me most bullish on that side of things.
Anthony, can I push back on the experimentation thing a little bit? Mm-hmm. So I agree with many aspects of experimentation, like pushing the frontier of Ethereum and developing all sorts of different directions. There's a lot of benefit that comes from that. On the other hand, there are those that would say that is further fracturing the Ethereum ecosystem. And so I notice a lot of chain fatigue out there, where it seems like, a new chain pops up, very little differentiation. They have a token, maybe they offer a bell and whistle, and it almost feels extractive. Or like another use case is you get, the 50th chain, and it's a separate island. It's not connected to any of the other chains. And so like, what am I going to do? I have to figure out like, how the hell am I going to track my assets on this brand new chain, and like interoperability, and did I bridge? I don't know. So experimentation and lack of standardization could lead to a more fragmented Ethereum. And you have an alternative layer 1, right, come up, and they say like, we have it all here, your common state, and you don't have to worry. It's all in kind of one platform. So there's also some fatigue with some of this experimentation I'm seeing. If we don't have experimentation with kind of like shared standardization, shared liquidity, then is the Ethereum ecosystem actually losing? What would you say to that?
I would say you've gone down 3 rabbit holes that could each be a podcast in themselves, in just that comment there, which was quite funny. But like, just as a general kind of, a rebuttal, if you will, it was already happening, right? As I said, like there were other layer 1s being spun up all the time to do this experimentation. So regardless of if Ethereum was doing it with layer 2s or it was kind of existing as layer 1s, it was kind of already happening in that sense. And I think that the fragmentation thing is like a short-term thing, long-term, not really a big deal. I think power law effects are just going to play out. We're going to, remove a lot of this kind of UX hardship for users. It just abstract it away longer term, right? So, I mean, I just generally don't think it's as big of an issue as people like to make it out. And, the ironic thing, I would bet that pretty much everyone who complains about it on crypto Twitter is doing the bridging, doing everything because they want to farm the airdrops. They want to make the money. They want to go where the action is. And they're just complaining about it because it's more cumbersome than, as you said, being on one chain. But I think we discussed this maybe even on the last episode we did together. I mean, I've discussed this endlessly on my own show. Like, we do the roll-up centric roadmap because we do not believe everything can be done on one layer, right? That's the whole point. Like, that's the entire point of the roll-up centric roadmap for Ethereum. And as I said, that is in of itself a podcast, but I'm not going to ramble on about that. But that's my general view there.
I mean, it's not just the power law concept. There's 4 incredibly talented, very, very well-funded teams building, bridging and cross-messaging. Like, you have CCIP, you have Layer 0, XLR, Wormhole. That technology will get better and better. Even if, like, we keep fragmented and everything else, it should get, like, a better user experience just because of those guys eventually sort of, like, finding the best solution for everybody, I think.
No, definitely. And I mean, I think that, as I said, like, that's just going to be abstracted away. So even if the underlying, technology, it gets better, but it doesn't get to the point where it feels as seamless as, using just one chain for things, it will to the end user. And that's all that matters ultimately, I think.
Yeah, maybe I could just to disagree a little or poke back, which would be, I actually think there's a decently strong incentive, at least for the leading L2s, to not be interoperable and integrate. Like, if I was sitting in charge of Optimism or Arbitrum, again, Jordi, I think you're totally right. There are so many great solutions out there. Where are they? Why haven't they been implemented? I think it's more of a social reason than a tech reason for not making these chains interoperable. And from the perspective of a small layer 2, it's like, hey guys, we should be interoperable. The big guys are like, yeah,
interop with me, please.
Yeah,
can that be?
Right?
That's the thing. Like, I agree, but can that be stopped? Right? If they want to be permissionless ecosystems, then eventually they're not going to be able to stop it, right? Or else they're not really permissionless. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And I think there's ultimately an interesting sort of tension, and I don't know how this ends up playing out, in between experimentation, which I think the layer 2 should be running right now. That's a huge benefit of being in a layer 2, is you get to push the limit a little bit in terms of the VM, for instance. But ultimately, I think the value proposition of layer 2 is similar to Ethereum or Lido or any of these sort of mass adopted protocols, is that it should be this like kind of ossified, extremely safe, permissionless sort of thing. And, maybe an interesting example would be that right now, when you interact with a dollar, right, like when you hold a dollar, it doesn't feel different to you based on which bank you're at or if you're in a different country. But in reality, it is. Every dollar is JPMD or BOAD, right? Or like a dollar in Europe has very different security assumptions and trust built in there than it does in the United States. But we don't feel the need to disclaim that. Why? Because we're all relatively certain that this dollar is going to be backed up and safe. And the reason why the UX still feels not great in crypto is because, if I was Coinbase, I feel the need to disclose to my user that this is not canonical ETH. This is an obligation of this chain, right? Like, that's why we feel the need to describe that to users, and what makes it so confusing. And so I think there are a couple of different ways that this could go, but really I think all roads point to fewer L2s in the future. I basically, like, maybe just to put a falsifiable prediction out there, and I can be proven wrong or right in a couple of years, I just think there are fewer L2s. Big general L2s.
That's why I'm like, how are you defining L2s here? Because you could say that there's like the Optimism superchain, the Arbitrum Orbit chain, the Polygon City, or the Polygon superchain, whatever they end up calling it. Like, those could be our few L2s, but like then they have all these little mini L2s in them that all natively interoperate, and then those things can talk to each other as well. So you could think of them like countries, right? United States has the different states. They're the different L2s. United States is, and then there's Europe, and it has all the different countries inside it. So like, that's how I think about it as well. Like, there's going to be very few of these kind of generalized ones, but they're all going to have like little L2s inside them that all interoperate.
That's basically how I think it's going to play out too. Yeah.
Yep.
So I think there'll be, I think, David, I've heard you describe it this way, almost like economic zones or trust zones or whatever you want to describe. And I think there'll be this sort of broad Ethereum trust zone and then minor almost alliances of different groups or bundles where interop works slightly better in between these different groups of chains that have split economics. And it's very difficult to predict how that's going to play out because a lot of that's going to be dependent on what the application actually ultimately ends up needing for interop. Like, here's something that looks like it might go together. You can already squint at it. Like Farcaster frames and NFTs are pretty interesting. So maybe there's this weird dynamic that is just invisible to us today where social and NFTs should be on the same platform. Like if Web3 social ends up being the front end distribution for new mints, then there's a strong incentive there to put NFTs and social on the same.
So Mike, you're saying there's sort of Ethereum and then the super chains, and the super chains would be like these 3 to 7, let's say, large economic zones, chains of chains basically, and you might have many chains on top of those.
Yeah, and then the competition vectors for different apps within those ecosystems will be to sort of push the limits and go out and attract users. And I think for the actual trust zone, the frameworks, right? Like Optimism is a framework, Arbitrum is a framework. The competition vector is going to be similar to what it is in ETH or Lido or any of these sort of like they want to be kind of flat and permissionless and ossified and safe and unopinionated. And I think that's ultimately going to be, right now, they should be taking risks, but I think ultimately they're going to end up competing on the same vector that a lot of our favorite protocols in crypto do today.
Jordi, do you agree with that? What do you think?
I'm just like thinking about something else, which is that we're going to start having issues around trade-offs. There's trade-offs everywhere. And like one trade-off could be, I have an app, I want to tap into the liquidity on Base, on Blast, on Mantle, on Arbitrum, everywhere else. So I want to deploy everywhere. And then maybe I want to share the experience. So I know like Vertex announced Vertex Edge, which is basically, they're just going to combine the liquidity across like multiple chains into their own like shared sequencer, which is a completely new like kind of like thing. And maybe you're giving up a little bit of risk or centralization or like, but actually the user experience across all the chains, now they get to like share liquidity. There's going to be these trade-offs that are quite interesting to see on the app layer. And especially like once like an app becomes very strong and gets like a lot of incentives given it to it, these trade-offs are going to really come into play, and we're going to start figuring out like how much, it's the age-old question, like how much do you want to give up in terms of like user experience in exchange for like, decentralization, like these types of things, where do you want somebody just MEV you to death, or do you want that, protected, where the Jareds from Subways are not sandwiching you all day?
If you enjoyed all of that, then you'll absolutely love the Bankless newsletter. Join over 300,000 fellow readers, all for free. Click below to sign up.